Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm going to get started now, although I may have to pause here and there just to let any stragglers come through. But I really want to make sure I get as much time with all of you as I can while also not taking up all of your evening. So, my name is Brooke Siem. I recognize a few of you who are here either from Instagram or a couple very good supportive friends. But there are a few names I don't recognize, and I'm so happy to have you here. But it also breaks my heart a little bit because I know what I've been through, and to think that other people are going through that as well. I hate that there are people for me to talk to, but I'm also so glad that you're here. So essentially what I want to do for about the next hour is just tell you a little bit more about my story and my own experience with antidepressant withdrawal. And then I'm going to open up the floor. I want to make sure that you guys can ask all the questions you want, and I will do my best to answer them. And, as many of you know, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a researcher, I'm not a scientist. I am just a regular person who was put on all these drugs. And I found that when I got off them, I didn't have very much support from no support from within the system. And then I didn't have really any support from anyone who knew what I was going through outside of the system either. I was so lucky to have supportive friends and my mom, who was my rock throughout all of this. And I worked with an unconventional counselor, and I can talk about that as well. But throughout all of this, I really didn't have anyone who I knew had spent the amount of time on these drugs that I had, and who kind of really understood what I was going through. And I found that to be one of the biggest missing pieces in my experience. And so now that I've spent a few years, I got off my last drug in, I think, about the summer of 2016. So it's been almost 4 years drug-free, which I'm really excited about. And I still am noticing that there's not a lot of voices out there about people who are really getting off and staying off the drugs. So that's what I'm hoping to do, is to just offer some support and understanding for all of you to know that I've been there and it's possible to live happily in a really great life after. So I'm just going to let one more person into the room, and then I will get officially started. I have also learned throughout all of this that I don't know that much about webinar technology, and so I'm learning as I go. Thank you for being patient with me. All right. Okay. So before I get started, the one thing that I really wanted to keep in mind here is for this particular meeting, and there will be 3 more after, and I'll tell you guys all about that at the end, but for this particular meeting, I wanted to keep audio off and video off for participants. And the reason is because this is a really sensitive topic, and for a lot of people, there's some privacy issues. There's just, some people have a lot of shame around it. So I didn't want anyone to feel pressure to have their face be on screen or feel like they had to say anything. So if we could all just keep muted and keep our video off, that would be really helpful, I think, for everyone. However, the chat box down on your little right-hand corner of your screen, if you scroll down to the bottom of Zoom, there's a little thing that says chat. If you click on that, feel free to type questions in at any point. I'm going to open it up for questions a little later on, but if you've got something that's really on your mind and you just have something you want to say, feel free to type it in there. Just be aware that everyone can see it, so just know, common sense, but I will do my best to answer as many questions as possible. Okay, so a little about me and my story. So I kind of think that my story really started when my father passed away suddenly when I was 15. I was abroad at the time. My mother and I were visiting family in Italy, and we got a call from my grandfather, and he told us that my father had gone into the emergency room for what he thought was going to be an ulcer surgery. And as it turned out, they found a grapefruit-sized mass of pancreatic cancer in his belly, and basically he went into surgery. They tried to remove it, and he never came out. So he was in the ICU, and my mother and I got on a plane, and we got on a few more planes, and about 48 hours later, we ended up back in my hometown, where we went straight to the hospital, said our goodbyes, and that was just kind of that. So for me, I was 15. I was an only child. This all happened so fast. 1 second, I'm just letting someone else in. So, hi. Okay. All right. So for me, I was an only child. I was 15. This all happened really, really, really fast. And I was, sorry guys, managing the room. Okay. So about 6 months went by after my father passed, and oops, Cindy, I'm going to mute you. Okay. Sorry, Cindy. We're just going to keep everybody off video, so it's anyone who wants to remain private can. Okay. So, this is how these things go, right? Sad stories, and then they get interrupted because that's life. Anyway, so I'm 15. I'm dealing with my father's sudden death. 9/11 happened a few weeks later as well. And so basically, my personal world and our collective world was just kind of in this absolute explosion of hell. And I personally wasn't really reacting much at all. I didn't have too many emotions one way or another. And it was concerning enough to the people around me that it was suggested that I go see a child psychiatrist. We went to the child psychologist. The child psychologist ultimately diagnosed me with a depressive and anxiety disorder. And I don't know, I went to her for a few months before I ultimately went and was sent to a child psychiatrist. When I ended up at the child psychiatrist, I was only in there for about 5-10 minutes. And by the end of it, I was given a cocktail of antidepressants and sent home. So I don't remember what the initial drugs I was put on were. This is a long time ago. The records have since been destroyed. But I know that I tried about 2 or 3 drugs before we found a cocktail that didn't make me sick. It didn't make me sleep. It didn't make me nauseous. And the cocktail of drugs I ended up on was Effexor XR, 37.5 milligrams, and Wellbutrin XL, which was 150 milligrams. Now, I have since learned that those are both very low compared to some of the horror stories I've heard. Effexor XR, what I was on, was the lowest dose you could possibly get. Wellbutrin was not the lowest dose, but there are people out there who are on hundreds of milligrams of these drugs. So I just want you to keep that in mind as I talk a little bit longer, because I experienced some pretty awful side effects of getting off these drugs, and I wasn't even on anywhere near the highest dose. So when I hear people and they've had these terrible experiences and they're on such high doses, my heart just breaks, because I know what happened to me, and it was not on these super high doses. Anyway, so at the time, I was also put on a few other drugs. I was put on 2 doses of Synthroid because I was diagnosed with hypothyroidism. I was put on something called sucralfate because I was diagnosed with bile reflux disease, which is basically something where you kind of puke up bile all the time. And I was put on, I think I was put on birth control around this time because of, cramps and being a woman. And also I started taking drugs because my skin was breaking out really bad. So I was on a variety of drugs for your skin. So in short, I was on between 6 and 8 drugs at a time for 15 years. Flash forward to 2016, and I had just turned 30 years old. I got an opportunity to travel around the world for a year. It kind of fell into my lap, absolutely out of the blue. And I was at a miserable place in my life. I was contemplating suicide. I didn't know really what else to do. I mean, my thought process at this point was, I am so depressed for someone who's been on antidepressants for 15 years. Like, what hope is there for me? What's left? So what's the point of all of this? And then I got this opportunity to travel around the world. And I kind of realized that this was something so out of left field that I couldn't ignore it and that I needed to take the opportunity. And in that process, I realized that, well, if I was going to be in the middle of nowhere, Thailand or Cambodia or Croatia or wherever I was going to be, I certainly did not trust that I was going to be able to get all of the drugs that I was on in a reliable way. And I also was very concerned about missing a dose or thinking I could get my drugs and then not, and ending up going into some sort of antidepressant withdrawal unexpectedly in the middle of a foreign country. My only reference at this point for antidepressant withdrawal was if I had missed a dosage accidentally, like, I just forgot in the morning and 4 hours later, my heart was beating out of my chest. And that was enough to tell me that this was not something I wanted to experience by myself abroad. So I called a psychiatrist. I went, and she told me, first of all, that she did not recommend that I get off all these drugs. And the second thing that she told me was that, well, if you're going to get off these drugs, then I'm going to provide you Prozac, and you should take Prozac to make the side effects better. And that to me was a very bizarre thing, that I went to her because I wanted to get off these drugs, and I walked out with more drugs. But I didn't end up taking the Prozac, and the reason why was because my father had spent a good portion of his life on it, and he absolutely hated it. And I figured if there was any sort of genetic connection here, then I was not interested in putting another drug into my system. So I started getting off these drugs. I started with the Effexor. My psychiatrist told me to just stop taking it cold turkey because, as I mentioned, I was on the lowest dose. If you do any amount of research at this point, like you're going to know that that's a terrible idea, and that she was a little off in her direction. And basically what happened is instantly my world started exploding. All of my senses changed. So my hearing changed. It got more sensitive. My eyesight got better. My skin got more sensitive, and even my taste buds started to change. That was the first thing I noticed, was the physical senses that changed in a few days off of getting off of the drugs. Then I got the shakes. I was nauseous all the time. I was sweating. The mood swings started to come in. But the time when I realized that I was perhaps way in over my head was when I started having violent, intrusive thoughts, specifically homicidal and self-harm thoughts. So I'd walk down the street, and to me, it just felt like a Quentin Tarantino movie just playing out in kind of my mind's eye of when I was walking down the street. And at that point is when I realized that, well, that was the point at which I thought that I had truly lost it, and that was my baseline. That kind of started to happen to me about 7 to 10 days into getting off the Effexor. I was only off the Effexor at this point, and I thought to myself, if this is what I'm seeing, if this is what's going on in my head, then I must be absolutely batshit crazy. And the thing was is that I didn't have any frame of reference of what my baseline was supposed to be, because I was put on these drugs when I was a teenager, and like an early teenager at that. So it's not like I could go back and say, oh, last year I was fine and now I'm not. Like my entire adult life had been spent on these drugs. So when I got off of them and my mind just went absolutely crazy, I had no reason to believe that that wasn't who I was. And so that was the point at which I became very scared and started to also get really, really, really angry, because I sort of felt like I had been duped. Like no one had warned me about this. I didn't understand how I had managed to go 15 years in the mental health system without someone telling me, hey, when you get off these drugs, you might be worried that you're going to kill someone. But that's exactly how I felt. And so I called a family friend who was a psychologist, and she lived across the country. So I knew that she had no power in the state of New York. And that was the other problem, is that I was afraid to go back to my doctor, because if I told her that I was having these thoughts, I knew she could put me on an involuntary hold, in which case I'd end up in a psychiatric hospital and put back on drugs. And I was cognitive enough to know that that was not the right call. And I didn't trust her. And so I decided the better option, again, I don't know if I wouldn't recommend this to a friend, but this is what I did. I locked myself in my apartment and basically rode out Effexor for about another week and a half until the truly awful intrusive thoughts started to subside. and they did start to subside. At that point, I was still dealing with the mood swings. I was still dealing with all the changes to my vision and hearing. And I was also getting ready to travel around the world for a year. So I had this epic side project that was able to kind of distract me from the sheer physical hell of all of this. And when I did that, I got to a point where I said, okay, I made it through about a month of Effexor withdrawal, and that I was, looking at my time clock, and I had about 3 more months before I was supposed to get on a plane. So I said, I'm going to get off the Wellbutrin. I went back to the psychiatrist's office. We completely somehow missed our appointment time, so I didn't see her. Instead, she came to me in the waiting room, and I told her I wanted to get off the Wellbutrin, and she basically just rolled her eyes, said, okay, call me if you have an issue, and walked away. And that was the last time I ever saw her. And so I stopped taking the Wellbutrin as well. I did not have immediate severe Wellbutrin withdrawal effects in the same way I had from Effexor. However, I still just, the mood swings at this point was what was the most severe. And I had a lot of rage, which really concerned me. I got so angry at one point that I bent a metal ironing board in half while, near a hot iron. It was not my best moment, but it just highlights how much red hot rage was pulsing through my body during this point that I just couldn't control. And so it was after I bent the metal ironing board in half that I decided I needed some outside help. But at this point, I was so angry at the mental health care system that I didn't want to go in network, if you will. So I found a spiritual counselor. It was something I would have never, ever considered at any point up until then, but I was so desperate that I started working with him. And when I say spiritual, it was not religion based. It was just more like we kind of talked more about the greater meaning of who we are in the world and that sort of thing, as opposed to God or, the DSM-5. So I worked with him for about a year, and that was one of the key aspects of my healing, and I'd be happy to talk about that. I'm going to talk a little bit more, and then I'm going to open it up. So the biggest thing that I started to realize as I was going through this withdrawal was that I was told that withdrawal would only take a couple weeks, and 4 or 5 months later, I was still having awful symptoms. And I started to really wonder if I would ever normalize, or if this was my new normal, or what was still going on. And one of the biggest things that I feel like people really need to know, especially people who spent as many years on the drugs as I did, or more, I think that, and there's a little bit of research that started to come out that's also started to corroborate my assumption, but basically the longer you spend on these drugs, the longer it takes to figure out what your new normal is. So for me, I had to come to the tough understanding that I spent 15 years including puberty, all of my development, all of the choices I had made that got me to the point I was in, they were all made through the lens of these drugs. And then when I got off them, I was effectively left with nothing. I had no idea who I was, down to what I liked to eat or the kind of music I like to listen to. And so in order to figure that out, it was going to take a really, really long time. And the amount of anger wrapped up in that, combined with the amount of grief and unprocessed trauma from losing my father, just created what ended up being about a year of nothing but self-work and a lot of tears and a lot of questions and a lot of wondering if I would ever meet any definition of okay. So know that it takes a really long time for some people if you've been on these drugs for a long time. So that's the biggest thing I really want people to know, is that if you're still withdrawing, it takes a long, long time after the drugs have stopped to start to feel and understand what it's like to be you again. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking about me right now and open the floor up for questions. So I mean, I can talk about me all day long. So if you guys don't have any questions, then you're in for an entertaining 40 minutes. But I'm going to go to the chat box now and see what's in there right now. Okay, so Roman says, yep, I did the same, locked myself away, rough 2 weeks. So yeah, I think what was so frustrating for me when I had to kind of make the choice of how to handle this was that I didn't feel safe within the system that put me on this in the first place. And I know not everybody feels that way. There are a lot of people who have had really good experiences with their therapists or psychiatrists or psychologists. There's also really wonderful psychiatrists and psychologists out there. And unfortunately for me, I have not discovered them until after I was off all these drugs. I had shit luck with my psychiatrists and psychologists growing up. And when I moved to New York, I had shit luck with them too. My general practitioner was actually the one who prescribed me all of my drugs for the entirety of my 8 years in New York. And I was never put in a position where someone said, we need to get you to someone who really knows what they're doing. And so therefore, I just assumed that all the doctors knew what they were doing, which, as it turned out, was the wrong move for me. But there are some really fantastic professionals out there now that I've had the pleasure of talking to. And I'm really pleased to see that there are a lot of people on our side who are acknowledging the dangers of these drugs. They're acknowledging the withdrawal effects, and they're calling for a lot of change. I'm really happy to see that. Okay. Oh, poor Patty. Okay, so Patty was saying that she was on 375 milligrams of one of these drugs and quit cold turkey, which, oh, you poor thing. Blind for 6 weeks and spent the winter in bed. Yeah, so there's something called a half-life of a lot of these drugs that I think is really important for the average patient to know about. So the half-life is the amount of time that these drugs stay in your system. So for example, Effexor has a really short half-life. So therefore, half-life means that like if you take a drug and then it's the amount of time it takes for half the drug to leave your system. So for example, if a drug had a half-life, like one drug could stay in your system for an hour, and a 30-minute half-life would mean that it only had 30 minutes later, half the drug was out of your system. I hope that makes sense. Not the best explaining science terms. Anyway, my point is that some drugs stay in your system a lot longer than others, and the ones for the psychotropic drugs like antidepressants, the ones that stay in your system for a shorter amount of time and have a short half-life, like Effexor XR, tend to have greater and more intense side effects, but they don't last as long. So the reason why I stopped taking the Effexor first was because we knew it had a short half-life, and so we expected the withdrawal effects to come quicker and more intense, which they did. However, the Wellbutrin stays in your system for a lot longer. It has a much longer half-life, and so therefore withdrawal effects don't necessarily hit your system until much later, to the point at which one of my doctors at one point said that you may even feel like you are relapsing 3 months later, when in reality, that's the drug just still coming out of your system. And that's a lot of the research that I'm starting to read up on right now that is saying that antidepressant withdrawal has really not been considered when they do antidepressant research, which is bizarre to me. It's like studying alcoholism without studying delirium tremens. Like, this is a thing that happens. But anyway, this is the way it is. So some doctors are getting a clue and they're actually studying it now, but what they're thinking is what's happening is that we're seeing patients who are having relapses after being off their drugs, few weeks, few months later, and they're starting to think that this is not actually a relapse, this is withdrawal, because the drug is still titrating through their system and working its way out. So it doesn't surprise me to hear that Patty was okay for a bit and then hit that wall, probably because that was part of at the point at which the drug started to really kind of titrate out of her system. God, Roman Davis has been such a cheerleader for me on Instagram, and I just want to say I really support it, I'm so glad to have his support, and it makes my heart warm a little bit. Okay. Rashawn asked, how did detoxing change your relationship with the people in my life? Okay, that's a really good question, Rashawn. So for me, not a lot of people knew that I was on all these antidepressants. It was something I felt a lot of shame over. I think because when I was put on these drugs, like it wasn't like it is now, where if you're not on antidepressants, you're kind of like the odd man out. Now, 2001, as far as I knew, I was one of the only kids who was on psychiatric drugs, and I just felt so like something was so wrong with me because of that. And so I really walked around with that weight and kept it quiet for most of my life. And so most of the people who I interacted with on a day-to-day basis didn't know that I took these drugs. And so luckily I was in a position at the time where when I was detoxing, I was able to work from home a lot, combined with the fact that because I was also preparing to leave the country, like at that point I owned a bakery, I'd more or less given most of the control over to my business partner. So she kind of handled it, and I would only have to go into the bakery once or twice a week. So I had a lot of time to not have to tell people why I was constantly in tears and couldn't stand, the sound of the grocery store because the grocery store was too loud that day. Like, it just makes you feel completely nuts. It's true. I had trouble going outside and being in the world. It was just too much input when I first got off the drugs. But for me, the biggest relationship that had to be addressed was the relationship with my mom, who was always my rock throughout the whole thing. But what started to happen is the more I started to talk about my experience with my mom, the more she started to tell me about the reasons why she put me on these drugs in the first place, and also why, like, more about her history and more about my father's history. So my relationship with my father changed a lot after I heard more about his story and why, the choices he made that may have influenced me growing up, and a lot of the issues that I was working through. Like, it was a very interesting thing to change your relationship with a dead person, but that's literally what I had to do. And I think I had to knock him off the pedestal I'd put him on and realize that he was a person who experienced a lot of pain in his life, and I think he transferred a lot of that pain onto me unintentionally, but it happened, and that now it was my burden, and just that's what I had to do. I had to deal with what he had given me. It was not my fault, but it was my responsibility to fix it. And that, changing that frame of mind around my father, I think has really changed all my relationships going forward, because I started to realize how much more responsibility I have in a relationship to change things I don't like about it. I've very much stopped looking at other people and other problems as the issue and said, okay, how can I fix this in me? Because at the end of the day, I've realized that, like, literally changing your relationship with a dead person, I'm the only one who's left to do the work. But in changing my own relationship with him, like, I healed. And so that was a huge, huge realization, that I had the power to heal myself and relationships by only doing the work myself without even involving the other person. Steph says, I wish we could help you get your book published. You are helping me right now. The more events I can do like this, and the more people who support what I'm doing, the more likely this book is to get published. So you guys are helping. Thank you. Hi, Patty. Okay. And Anne is asking about any forms of alternative medicine. And I'm going to just scroll through the comments right now and get right back to that. Okay. And before I answer your question, because it's a little bit longer, I'm just going to answer Kara's question. She asked, did I experience periods where I felt brain fog and like it was even hard to think? Did that feeling go away? Kara, I'd be curious to know, look, are you talking about during withdrawal or while I was depressed? Because I was in a very interesting place where, because I had this one thing to focus on, because I had to get ready to travel, and that involved a lot of due diligence, I was sort of forced to focus. But I don't specifically remember having brain fog, but also like I don't really remember much of that time in a way. Like in some ways I almost felt like it was a trauma in itself because it was so violent. What was going on in my head was just so awful. It was kind of constant. And so I don't I just that's what I remember. I remember the feelings of helplessness. I remember the sadness. I remember the tears. I remember the rage. I remember the bigness of how everything felt. And so in my downtime, I don't so much know if I was experiencing brain fog or if I was just not in a position to experience it because of all the things I also had to do. However, I will say that all of my symptoms eventually did go away. So my hypothesis and what I always tell people is as long as you're doing the personal work, I think the symptoms are likely to go away, but you have to do the personal work. Like just to wait it out, I don't think is the right call. And that brings me to Anne's question about alternative medicine assisting with withdrawal. Yes, so I did a form of alternative counseling. It was a method called Compassion Key, and there's a little bit of information about it online, not a ton. It was originally founded by a man named Edward Mannix, and that's who I worked with directly. And it's a method that allowed me to operate outside of myself. And the biggest reason why I thought Compassion Key was so helpful is because I was able to do it remotely from my own home. So, you know, in a way, I was like light years ahead of all this remote therapy we're doing right now. But I thought it was so helpful to be doing it remotely because for me, you know, whenever I'd been in a psychologist's office, it felt so much like a me versus the doctor. Like here was me, little old me, who's having problems in her life. And then this person who's supposed to have all the answers and all the degrees, and the balance of power never felt right for me in these meetings, combined with the fact that it was usually 45 minutes long. And like, you kind of can't really get anything done in 45 minutes once every 2 weeks, right? It was just, at best, I thought it was a bitch session. At worst, I thought it was a waste of time. You know, and then you throw the poor woman, she's got a clipboard and she's writing down things and she's slapping a diagnosis on you. Like nothing about the process felt healing for me. It felt like a diagnosis, not a healing process. But doing Compassion Key over the phone, I was in my own home. I could be in PJs. I didn't have to look at someone. It was all over the phone. So therefore, like if I was a crying mess and had snot all over my face, who cared? No one could see it. And for me, that was really important because it allowed me to connect to my body and feel what I was feeling in my body when I was talking to Edward. And then it also allowed me to just speak freely without judgment because I wasn't in front of anyone to judge. And then the technique itself, I found to just be helpful because it allowed me to verbalize feelings that I had not ever really been able to verbalize. And a lot of that is just in the technique itself. And it happened to work for me. You know, I think there are tons of routes to the same path. I mean, when I had my Washington Post article published, I got like a dozen responses of people who said that, oh, they went vegan or cut out dairy and it cured their depression. Like, I don't know, who am I to say that that doesn't work for some people? So my point here is that I think that anything you can do to stack the deck in your favor is the way to move forward with this. I think that for a lot of people, it's really important to have traditional psychiatrists and psychologists on your side. I would never recommend going off any of these drugs without first talking to your doctor, because if there's a way you can make it easier on yourself, like, please do it. But also, we have to understand that the traditional medical system operates in a box. They go to medical school, they're taught one thing and they are taught to think that way. It's why when we break our leg and need to get surgery, we don't go to an acupuncturist. We go to a doctor who knows how to fix your leg. And that makes sense in a lot of ways, but I don't think it fully makes sense when it comes to the human psyche, because we can't just put a splint on our brain in order to fix it. Different people have different requirements for what they need to be happy and healthy. We're all in different situations. We all have different experiences. We all have different emotional capacities. And I just frankly don't think that someone who sees me for 45 minutes and is trying to diagnose me from a book knows how to fully handle that. And so I say, bring in a team. Like, whatever your financial abilities are, bring in a team. If you don't have a lot of financial abilities, there's so much free support online and, things like yoga and whatnot. Like, I think sometimes we can roll our eyes and say that's silly and yoga is not going to help me feel better, but it's not that the yoga itself makes you feel better. It's the fact that you make a different choice and you start doing something new and you teach your brain to experience new things and you take yourself out of your old patterns. If you do that enough, it's going to start accumulating and create a positive outlook. And that's why I think it's important to search for anything you can that feels right to you. But again, like finding a good therapist or finding a good husband or wife or finding a good yoga studio, you have to understand that if the first one doesn't work, well, you don't just give up, you try again. Like, you are your own unique individual person, and what works for you may not work for me. And the onus is on us as individuals to go out and find the thing that's going to work for us. And that's how you have success here. It's when you never, it's so cliche, but you can't give up on yourself and you have to try again. Because if you truly believe that there is hope out there, you will find it, but you have to do the work. No one's going to be able to do that for you. And it's a really, really shitty thing to finally accept and do because it's hard. Okay. Brain zaps or balance problems. Someone is asking if I ever experienced brain zaps or balance problems, any symptoms from withdrawal that still linger. Okay, so I never experienced brain zaps. It's apparently really common. I haven't experienced it. I don't know why I didn't experience them, and I know that they're common on Effexor, but I just didn't. Balance problems though. So I don't remember experiencing balance problems specifically, but I had some very unexpected physical issues, like physical performance issues. So I was a competitive CrossFit athlete while I was medicated. And basically, as soon as I got off the medication, my athletic prowess just absolutely plummeted. I felt like my body kind of didn't work the way it had been used to. It's almost like the connection between my head and my body wasn't really quite there. Like, I'd tell it to do something and it wouldn't work. And I'd been doing CrossFit for so long at that point that I really knew when something was off in my body. So I didn't, I would say that there probably were some balance problems that I experienced there. Let's see. I also found that physically my threshold for pain was a lot lower all around. And I found that to be really surprising because I had thought that I had this unbelievable pain threshold my entire life. And then I got off these drugs and I realized, no, it's not that I had pain tolerance. I was just so fucking numb. So I was having like little toddler like meltdowns if I stubbed my toe or got a paper cut because the pain was just so overwhelming for me. And I found that when I was exercising, that was the case as well. Like my tolerance for the sort of lactic acid pain that comes when you're working out was suddenly non-existent. And so my entire relationship with my physical body had to change at that point. However, I'll also say that it did get better. It did right itself after a while. I had to go a lot easier on myself and basically go back to the idea of being a beginner and work on this stuff and retrain myself. But it did get better over time. But I had to make the conscious choice to go work on it. And that was the thing, right? Like, I think a lot of times we really want to think that we've gotten on this path of antidepressants and then we're in withdrawal, so we go back to who we were before. And in my experience, we don't go back, we start over. We have to get to know ourselves now as this new person, because not only is your brain and your body learning to work without the aid of these drugs we've been on for so long, but also you have amassed a whole bunch of new experiences and new shit to deal with. So on the one hand, you're more mature, which is great because theoretically we should be able to, handle things a little bit better the older we get and the more experiences we have. But on the other hand, like in my case, it wasn't, I couldn't go back to being 15 again. I had to be 30. And I didn't feel like I knew how to be 30 without being on these drugs. So I describe it like going through a second puberty. It was bizarre to feel like I had the same confusion and hormonal struggles and mood swings as a 15-year-old does, but that really is what I felt. So realizing that like we're not going back here. We're learning who we are again, and that's part of the process. I mean, you know, for Steph, it may quite literally be like learning to walk, learning to balance again. That may be the best place to start. Oh, sorry, Patty. Compassion key. Compassion key is the, I'm typing it in here. Compassion key is the name of the modality that I used. There are multiple practitioners all around the world who do this. There's not a lot of them. I mean, there's about 100 total, and they're in various time zones. And there are, you know, some that I've worked with who are absolutely wonderful, and I've seen a lot of people have some good results with this. So, all right, yeah, I agree with Roman. I advocate for folks to cast a very wide net on all available treatment options. Absolutely. I'm very much curious about what's going on with MAPS, which is the multidisciplinary study for psychedelic science, something like that. Oh God, I should really learn the acronym. Anyway, there's a bunch of research being done at Johns Hopkins University in Stanford about the use of psychedelic mushrooms and MDMA for helping people with depression and trauma. I have not done that kind of therapy myself. However, I fully support it, and I think it's amazing that there's a lot of support behind that, because it's a completely out of the box process that I don't think we would have entertained even 5 years ago. So there's so many good, cool things that are happening right now. So try acupuncture, try anything you can, just see what fits and what works for you. And know that it might change. What works for you for 6 months, you may need to mix it up after a while. Anne asks, have you changed your diet to assist with your healing? So I have not specifically changed my diet. You know, I've not adopted, you know, a particular kind of diet to assist. However, it's a little bit more of a complicated topic for me, because I also spent many of these years with an eating disorder. And so when I was getting off these drugs and traveling, I was very conscious of the fact that I didn't want to slip back into old disordered eating habits. So putting strict, like, you can't have this, or bad foods, good foods, whatever it is, was not a good strategy for me. However, I will say that when I got off the drugs, and the more I started to take care of my soul, the more I started to take care of my body. And it wasn't a conscious thing. I just found that, you know, when I was healing inside, then I didn't feel as much of a need to drown myself in wine or a pint of ice cream. You know, they kind of came hand in hand. And so now I find myself much more in tune with my body than I ever was before. MST. So Kara asked, how the heck was I able to work during this? I've been on disability and need to go back. Do you have any advice? Okay. So I was able to work because I was in an abnormal situation where I didn't necessarily have to go into work. At that point, I owned my bakery, and I was going in maybe 2 days a week. And then I was also doing a lot of freelance writing, and I had a boss with an office, and occasionally I would go in, but during this time I pretty much just told him, like, I can't do it. And so I'm staying home. I will say that when I was at the bakery, I have multiple memories of completely losing it when I was at the bakery. I mean, at one point, I think I was literally in the freezer just sobbing, because that's what was happening that day. I mean, I was lucky that I was my own boss; nobody could fire me. But as far, you know, so I don't know what you do, Kara, so I don't know exactly what it is, but I think the biggest thing that I would do is to find ways to self-soothe, and during the day, create rituals before and after work, find ways to kind of contain to compartmentalize and contain, I think is part of what I might recommend doing. I don't know if you ever saw the Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt, but there's a quote she has where you can do anything for 10 seconds. and I really truly believe that we can get ourselves under, to do what we need to do for 10 seconds. And after 10 seconds, you keep doing it for another 10 seconds. So I think on some level, when you kind of make the mental choice to say like, okay, I have to do this, like you're going to surprise yourself with how strong you are. But I think that you also really need to make sure that you have the support outside of work. I mean, if you can argue for working from home for a couple days a week, I think you should do it. Just anything to kind of ease the transition. And then also, I think that for me, you asked like, how was I able to work? Well, the answer was I had to work. Like for me, like I had to get my job done because I had to be able to get all my ducks in a row so I could leave. And having that focus, that was not on how shitty I was feeling. It was actually, I think, a bigger lifesaver than I really gave it credit for at the time. Like all I wanted to do was crawl into a ball and cry in bed by myself, but I couldn't. I had to do it. And so you muster up the strength, you find it. So I think that's the best advice I could offer you. I'm really sorry about that. I can't get a little more specific there because I don't quite know your situation, and I was kind of lucky in that sense to be my own boss at the time. Can I elaborate more about the differences I experienced in sensory perception while you're on the meds versus off meds? So yes, so for me, this is the moment I knew that I had sort of entered into antidepressant withdrawal, if you will. I was standing on the street of New York, and I was walking home, and it started to rain. And I was wearing like a t-shirt for the first time because it was early spring. And all of a sudden I noticed that I could feel the raindrops on my skin. And it felt just like, I mean, it was the most clarifying moment because in just kind of this one instance, it's like everything around me got turned up to HD. I could see light bulbs where there was once just a glow of light, and everything got louder, and my skin, it almost hurt. It felt like when the raindrops hit that it hurt, like little BBs. And I just kind of stood there, and I literally held my arms out like this, and I looked at everything, and I just felt how intense these basic things were. And to me, it felt like I had been wrapped in cellophane, and then somebody pulled off the cellophane, and I was feeling for the first time. And I was actually a little bit in awe of this moment because I just had this sudden understanding of, oh my God, if this is how I feel when it comes to raindrops on my skin, what else is new? What else is different? What else haven't I experienced, or am I going to experience? It was both scary and exciting and wonderful and awful all at the same time. And since then, the side effect that's really stuck around the most is in my hearing. So my eyes, everything kind of my vision came into place, and then it just sort of stayed there. My hearing, though, has continued to be super, super sensitive and I'm not great in noise. And that has not changed since I got off the drugs. I have developed a thicker skin around it. I'm better than I used to be. I used to have panic attacks if I was around construction or other sort of power tools, but that stopped happening again because I worked on it. I did a lot of work with my counselor on this. And now I can, walk down the street, and if I hear construction noise or power tool or something, I can make it through. But I'm not good with it. I am not necessarily an even happy, calm person around noise that a lot of people would consider background noise. So that has stuck around with me, and it is something I continue to deal with and I continue to work on. FMLA. Steph, can you elaborate what FMLA is? Family medical leave, is that what that is? Okay. All right, so, okay. Yeah. Okay. Roman is asking, what advice do you give to individuals who must detox alone? Detoxing sucks. but the perceived shame of going through withdrawals was not something I wanted anyone to know about. So the first thing, I mean, this may be counterintuitive, but for me, the first and probably the most important thing I did when I was detoxing is I got off the goddamn internet. It is so easy when you are that vulnerable and you are hurting that much to go into a chat room and see that there are hundreds, if not thousands of other people who are experiencing something similar to you. And in my case, I didn't feel solidarity. I felt hopelessness when I saw that there were other people who were experiencing this and that nobody had found a way out. To me, that was just like, you know, put a fork in me, I'm done. I did not want to be around that energy. And I think being alone, and I was living alone at the time, I did have a dog, which was key. But for me, I had to make a very conscious effort to stay away from anything and everything that had the potential to make me spiral even further than I already was. So what that looked like is I watched a lot of reruns of Friends. I did a lot of, I got some watercolors, which I had never painted before, and I just started painting. I also kind of stopped sleeping. I went from sleeping like 12 hours a night because it's super easy on the drugs to sleeping like nothing. So I'd be up at 2 a.m. with nothing to do and not wanting to be on the internet. So I would paint, and not well, but doing something with color, something with my hands, something quiet. I would put earplugs in because it was too loud even in my apartment, the street noise. So I'd put earplugs in and I would just paint. I did a lot of things with my hands. I got like this stuff called sand with the umlauts over the A's. And it's like this clay sand. So you can mold it like wet sand, but it's dry sand. I got it at Brooke Siem. It's a really cool thing, but just something physical to touch was really important. I cooked. I basically just kind of said, okay, I'm detoxing by myself. This is awful, but I'm not going to make it worse. And if I don't want to tell anyone about it, then, well, permission to just be by myself for a week and be alone and do whatever makes me feel better. If that's sleeping all afternoon, great. If it's taking my dog for a walk, great. If it's eating cereal for dinner, whatever, didn't matter. I just gave myself full permission to do that. But then the most important thing I also had to do at the time was really take care to pay attention to the little moments of light. Because I'd be so curious to know if any of you all have experienced this, but as awful as withdrawal was for me, I had these moments that were just like so eye-opening, and they just created so much curiosity in me. Like the raindrop thing. I mean, as frustrated as I was that I felt like, oh, this is the first time I'm feeling raindrops in my adult life, I was also like, I can feel raindrops now. What else is there? You know, music started to sound different to me. It started to sound bigger. I found myself laughing at Friends in a way I hadn't laughed at Friends in 15 years, even though I'd seen them dozens of times. When I was painting, the colors seemed brighter. Like they were these, I called them glimmers of hope, because I just had to hold on to the fact that if I could laugh harder than I had ever laughed at a TV show I'd seen a dozen times, then maybe I could do that 2 days in a row. You know, yes, maybe I only got like one good moment today and all the rest of them were shitty, but maybe tomorrow I could get 2. And it sounds so kind of trite in a way, but it really, really mattered to me. It mattered when I called my mom and she told me, you sound different. She said, I haven't heard you sound like you since before you were on these drugs. Like knowing that there was something changing, even though it was so hard for me every day, is the biggest thing that got me through. You just like those little things, they really matter, and you have to learn how to focus on them. That's why I say get off the internet, because the internet's full of a lot of big things that we can't do anything about. It's really, really terrible there. Yeah. So, okay. Oh, Patty, I just wish I could hug you right now. Oh, Patty. I think too, you know, we kind of need to So one of the things that Compassion Key, the strategies that a lot of the phrases we use start with the phrase "I'm so sorry," and we kind of use it in a way where you sort of talk to yourself in a way like, "I'm so sorry, you're sad," but it's called Compassion Key, right? And we always talk about self-compassion, but we never really tell people how to have self-compassion for themselves. And so, Patty, for you, I think I might, to the extent that you can, like, I don't know if you have kids, but I'm sure, think of someone you've cared about for in your life. And if you can, for a moment, think of what you're going through right now as what someone you really care about is what they're going through, right? If you could say to that person, "I am so sorry, this is so hard. I am so sorry you're sad. I am so sorry you don't know if it's going to get better." Like, think of how you would talk to a small child or someone you really care for, and think of the feeling you have for someone when they're in that much pain. And then try and turn that back onto yourself, because I'm sitting here, hearing this little bit of your story, and all I can think to myself is, "I'm so sorry this is happening to you, and I just want to take you in this big hug and let you cry until you feel better." And we have to learn to give ourselves that same level of compassion, because it's the only thing that's going to get us through. Because this is a journey that we pretty much have to do alone. For those of us who are really lucky to have support, like, that support is key. But at the end of the day, it's all about the choices we decide to make and how we're going to help ourselves. So, because as Roman's saying, it's so challenging to love all of oneself. If you can literally in your mind imagine yourself away from yourself. And in my head, I like to think of it as a stage, like a black stage. And then I kind of close my eyes and I'll see myself in pain, but it's something outside of me. And to that vision I kind of see outside of me, I'll say to her, I'm so sorry you're hurting. And I will say it out loud. I'll say, "I'm so sorry you're hurting. I'm so sorry you're sad. I'm so sorry you're angry. I'm so sorry you feel betrayed." And to say these words outside to kind of figment of yourself, I find to be really, really powerful. And it's just something that's helped me, because I think we try so hard to keep it together, and eventually we break. We're not meant to keep it together this long. And so, those breaks that we have, like, embrace them, let them be a part of this journey. I do truly think that the more those breaks we have, the less we have overall, if that makes sense. Like, let them happen. And then it's kind of like, putting a little penny into the piggy bank of the future, is that have them now, have them in your safe space, cry for 5 hours if you need, like, let it happen. And then we all know what it's like to feel a little bit better after that. So I just, I wish I could just help you even more, but I hope that something here is helping you. Okay. Yeah. Roman is saying that the small moments that got me through when flowers bloomed and the peas needed harvesting. Yeah. A lot of people say that having something to care for is really helpful. And I found that to be the truth too. I think if I didn't have to keep my dog alive, I'm not sure I would have been alive. So peas sound like a good thing. All right. So let's see. It's been about an hour, and I don't want to take any more of your guys' time, but I really appreciate you all being here. I hope that something I've said has been helpful. So my thought about all of this was to have four meetings. The first one, I just wanted to answer questions, just to provide that opportunity for people. But then the next three, I'm actually planning on giving much more actionable techniques. There are three in particular that, two techniques in particular, and then one thing I just really want to talk about. So next week, I'll be talking about how I calculated the day of my own death and how I think that may have actually saved my life. It sounds really, really morbid, but it's not. It just actually gave me a huge amount of life and helped me to start to understand what people meant when they talked about gratitude, because it's really not something I ever got. And I calculated my own death in the middle of depression, and then it really helped me through all of the antidepressant withdrawal. So that's what I'm going to go through next week, and I'll give everyone some little take-home PDFs on that. And then the next week after that, we're going to talk about a strategy I developed called the 51%. And that is basically, you know, I found that it was really frustrating to have people tell me like, oh, be happy and like choose happiness and all that crap. And I was like, fuck that. I can't even like choose to get out of bed. So I developed this strategy called the 51%, which is effectively, you know, I already knew how many days I had calculated to live. And so I figured, well, if more than half of those days I can say are good days, then I've done my job. Then it was worth it. Like in a world of zeros and ones, I was just looking to get to 51%. So in week 3, I'm going to talk about calculating my 51% and how I actually tracked my days in order to very rationally create a graph of happiness, which when I was in such an emotional hell of a place, there wasn't a lot of rationality. So this really helps ground me into rationality. So that's week 3. And then on week 4, I'm going to, I really want to introduce you guys to a lot of the people who I've found to be really important and who are doing really good work, because, you know, at first I was just so angry at psychiatry and thought that they were all shit. And I've now learned that it's just not the case. There are a lot of really good people. And I think that, you know, as individuals, the more we can learn and support the people who are doing research on topics that matter to us, like the more empowered we feel, and also the more we can help the cause. So I just want to introduce you guys to a lot of the people who I have been researching and following and interacting with, because it's so helpful for me to know that it's not just a bunch of like us poor patients running around, and it's not just a bunch of patients running around saying there's a problem. There are people here who are professionals, who are researchers, who have been in school for a long, long time, who do believe us, and we need to make sure that we all know about those people. So those are my 4 plans. I think it was Patty. Someone asked earlier how you guys can help me. The biggest thing that people can do right now is to, one, if like follow me on Twitter. If anything I say resonates for you, please retweet it. Like a bigger following for me means I'm more likely to get a book deal sooner rather than later. I really do believe this book is going to get published. It's been edited by way too many great people who have said it's fantastic to have it be never see the light of day. So it's just a matter of time, but it's still a really hard process. And so the more following, the better. The other thing is that, you know, for the next 3 sessions, I am going to charge. I'm only charging $12 a class if you do it by the class, or if you sign up for all 3, it'll be just $30 total. The reason why I'm charging is for 2 reasons. One, I noticed that for myself, I'm just a lot more likely to get value out of something I paid for. Like, it's so easy to just sign up for something that's free and then brush it off. But I find that even if I pay $10 for something, then I actually use it and I care for it and I invest in it. And I know that a lot of, like, especially when it comes to investing in yourself, like, we really only follow through when we feel like we have a reason and that we've paid a little bit for it. So, and then also it just helps me with my time. I really want to make it as affordable as I can. And so, like I said, it's only $12 for a single session or $30 for all 3. And so I'm going to drop the link in the chat box here. Those are for the next 3 weeks. Other than that, I mean, just your continued support is really the best I can ask for right now. This is, you know, I'm not trying to get rich off of this, believe me. I just want to help as many people as possible. So I've been really happy to be with you guys this past hour. And my inbox is also always open. You can email me at brooke@brookesiem.com. And I promise I'll get back to you when I can. Patty, do I have a pay link? You know, yes, I do actually. Here, one second. So I have a PayPal me as well. If like I mean, look, guys, I am so happy if you want to throw a couple bucks my way to help me, like, I am super grateful for it, but it's also not expected. And but if it's something you feel like would help me and help you, please go for it. I'm not going to say no, but also I'm really just trying to do everything I can for all you guys, and it does help, but it's, you know, getting to chat with you is what helps keep me going, and all your kind messages. I gotta say, the messages, guys, like, keep them coming, please. Like, I see them, and they remind me that this is why I'm choosing to devote my life to this, is because there are other people who still need help. So with that said, yeah, unless there are any final questions, I'm gonna close the room. Like, stick around for a few minutes, but you've all been great. And yeah, so anyway, all right, bye. Patty, I can email you separately if you want. All right, thank you, Steph. Thank you, Kara. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rashawn, Roman, everyone, Michelle. You guys are great. Bye.